Hi everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about water pollution. When we talk about water pollution, we're talking about substances, whether it be chemicals or organisms that end up getting into bodies of water that end up contaminating the water. So there's going to be ones that are synthetic. So synthetic are what humans produce, usually from like factories, or it also could be natural. So in the form of human sewage or animal excrement. We talked about non-point sources and point sources before, but just to reiterate, so a non-point source is when you can't identify necessarily the exact place that the pollution is happening, such as the runoff from farms from the use of fertilizers. Or if we're talking about point sources, it says it's a discrete location. So this is something you can identify, such as a sewer pipe or something exactly from like a factory that's going directly into the ocean or maybe lakes or ponds or streams. There are 12 main sources of water pollution that is discussed in Barron's, and we'll kind of just go through each one. So with air pollution, the way that air pollution leads to water pollution is just what is released in the air. So there's mercury that gets into air, the SOx, the NOx, there's ammonia. They end up mixing with water from rain to go into bodies of water. Another example would be like carbon dioxide. So the combustion of fossil fuels releases carbon dioxide, and the ocean will naturally absorb that carbon dioxide to make carbonic acid. And that ends up reacting with the calcium carbonate that's in shelled organisms. And then just this part right here on the top right-hand corner with acid rain. So acid rain is formed from either the NOx or the SOx. So for the combustion of coal, for the SOx, the NOx would be from vehicle emissions. They end up mixing with water, right? So from rain to either form nitric acid, the HNO3, or sulfuric acid for the H2SO4. So those would be examples how air pollution can lead to water pollution. Another example is methyl mercury. So methyl is just a CH3 group here, and then mercury, that is Hg. So mercury in general, hopefully you know that it's toxic, comes from natural sources such as all of these. There's also anthropogenic, so these human-related sources, which include the combustion of coal, waste incineration. So if we were to burn waste, that would go up into the air. And then eventually, with rain, go back down into the water, and metal processing, such as smelting. Another example of where we can get our mercury is something called bioaccumulation. So in terms of small organisms like phytoplankton, they can absorb, or they can, ingest mercury, and then the small fish will eat the phytoplankton, which has mercury, and then tuna, which is a very large fish, will end up eating the smaller fish, which has the mercury, and it just bioaccumulated. So the amount gets larger and larger. And then we consume tuna, and so we consume tuna, and then we get mercury in our bodies. And an example of the methyl mercury in terms of how that is made is with bacteria. So bacteria, they will process sulfate that's in the environment naturally, and then through its processes just makes the mercury turn into methyl mercury, which is more toxic than regular mercury. And an example, pretty famous example of mercury poisoning was in Minamata, Japan. So a corporation, before rules and regulations were set in place, before we actually knew the toxic effects of methyl mercury, this company would just release methyl mercury into the bay in the 30s to 68, and it poisoned the city's food supply. Why? Because the source of food would be the fish, and the fish would be swimming into this into the bay area and absorb that mercury, and then humans would consume it, and then ended up that the disease, I guess, was named after that area, called Minamata disease. So people would lose sensation in their hands and their feet, vision would be blurry, and many people ended up dying. And Shinobu Sakamoto, she was the kind of the spokesperson to talk about the disease. She traveled to the UN and was able to be a real life example of the effects of just having no regulations in terms of our bodies of water. So in addition to mercury, there's many other chemicals that are in the Barron's book, but one main chemical would be like an oil spill. So just oils in general. So oils, it's toxic to aquatic life. It's toxic to the birds that depend on consuming the aquatic life, and also just if oil gets on different birds, they are not able to fly just because of the oil that it's coating the feathers. Another example would be for gasoline. So for gasoline, we can add something called methyl butyl ether, so MTBE. So that ends up poisoning the water supply. In crude oil, there's something called polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, abbreviated as PAH. So that also will affect marine life. And also other chemicals such as drug prescriptions. So a lot of people, I guess, I don't know if this is still happening now, but if your medication is expired, some people would just flush the medication down the drain or maybe through the toilet, and it goes up into our sewer system. And for wastewater treatment facilities, so this is where our sewage goes to, how it's processed, these facilities are not prepared or they're not equipped to filter out these chemicals, these pharmaceuticals, and it ends up going back into the oceans. And it ends up, for example, ingredients from birth control pills, they can cause gender bending hormonal effects in frogs and fish and just disrupt reproduction growth processes. So in terms, just so you know, if you do have expired pharmaceuticals or just medications that you're not using, maybe don't throw them away in the trash can, because they can go in our landfills and eventually it will go into our water system from the rain through runoff. You can give it to a household hazardous waste area. And I was just looking up information for Arcadia. You can dispose of it at the CVS pharmacy on Baldwin. And in terms of microbiological sources, so these are disease-causing pathogens that are going to get people sick. It's going to get the aquatic life sick, and a lot of waterborne illnesses are from water pollution. So these are some good ones to know. Oh, and then this last bullet here says about 25% of all beaches have water pollution advisories, or they're closed each year due to bacterial buildup. So just as an example, if you ever volunteered with Heal the Bay, they will give you a little orientation right before we do the beach cleanup. And then they're actually saying that you should, after it rains, that you should not go in the ocean at least 72 hours after that, just because of all the runoff that is from the streets goes directly into the storm drain into the ocean, and there's a lot of bacteria at that time. So you have to wait about 3 days or so to let the bacteria kind of die off to make it a little bit safer for us to swim in. Another way that water can get polluted is through mining. Okay, so mining is on the land, but in terms of what ends up happening is you have these machines that will dig up the ground and then just deposit all the stuff that is unused. So the stuff that is unused, such as like iron and things like that, also with sulfur, can end up going back into the water system through groundwater after it rains. So normally this is like locked inside the mountains, but now we're like kind of digging it up. So we're loosening it up, and then we're going to have rainfall. And so rainfall will end up dissolving this, and it ends up going into our groundwater, going into the oceans. Oh, that example right here is called acid drainage. So with acid drainage, you have stuff like pyrite. So if you're digging for iron, so iron usually is bonded to sulfur. And so you have like iron sulfides that mixes with air, mixes with water. Then you can make sulfuric acid. And so once you have sulfur there, you can also have like iron. So this color right here, this rusty kind of color, that's going to be maybe iron 3 or some type of iron ion, ION, that ends up going into the water. And then sulfuric acid can also dissolve other metals, according to the activity series, if you remember from chemistry. So that ends up dissolving different metals that are in the land, and it will end up going into the ocean. Other parts of water, there's something called water hardness. So water hardness, that is a measure of how much calcium or magnesium ions are in the water. An example of that one would be in California. So in California, we're known for hard water because we have a lot of minerals, we have a lot of metals, we have lots of calcium and magnesium, and it ends up like building up, depositing on maybe like a faucet or something like that. And then one way, if you wanted to get rid of this, you could use an acid. And so you can use an acid because this is calcium buildup. You could use maybe something like vinegar, and you'll notice it'll start to bubble, just like when you put vinegar and baking soda together. Another vocab word just for when we're talking about acid, be familiar with pH. I think we've talked about that before. And then in terms of water pollution, there could be noise pollution in the water. Right? So for noise pollution in the water, usually it's by like boats. Right? It's going to be boats, recreational boating, it says commercial shipping boats, military sonar, so they're sending signals, and it's just disrupting the aquatic life that's in the water. So many marine organisms, it says sea turtles, fish, they use this to communicate, use it to navigate, use it to hunt, and then we're disrupting their way of life. So in terms of chemical pollutants, talked about a whole bunch of those in the previous slides. There's also non-chemical pollutants, such as noise. And then we'll also talk about thermal and all these in a second. Right. With nutrient pollution, we've also discussed this before. So with farms, we have to use, or farms use fertilizers, and a lot of fertilizers will have nitrates, they're going to have phosphates, and that's going to end up after rainfall going into our groundwater, maybe going to the ocean, and that causes something called cultural eutrophication. So this is when we talked about the algal blooms, and then if you have a lot of algal blooms, it kind of blocks the stuff underneath from getting oxygen, and then there's something called hypoxia somewhere, maybe it's on the next slide, and we've talked about dead zones as well. Here, hypoxic zones and dead zones. And let's see what else here. I think for these, we've talked about these before as well. All right, so I'm going to skip this slide. So in terms of other vocab words, let's see, there's something called BOD, or biological oxygen demand. So this is just how much bacteria will absorb oxygen from the water. And an example of that, if you're looking at like high BOD levels, that would be areas like coral reefs. And so coral reefs, there's a lot of activity there. We would say it has a high BOD. And then if you have eutrophication taking place, you have these dead zones, you have hypoxia, then you'd have less oxygen. So you have a lower BOD. And then vocab word dissolved oxygen. Sometimes you see it as DO, capital D, capital O. It refers to how much oxygen that is dissolved in water. Okay? So just basically oxygen that's in aqueous form. So for other chemicals, I just briefly talked about oil spills in the previous slides, but just to kind of show you, this is just more information about what ends up happening with oil spills. We talked about the feathers. Let's see, in terms of, I guess, the good thing, a positive, if there is a positive about oil spills, is that oil will float on top of water. Okay? So if oil floats on top of water, it makes it, I guess, easier to clean up, right? Instead of it like being down at the bottom of the ocean or just like mixed into water. And so in terms of removing it, you could use, let's see right here, you could use microorganisms to break down the oil, you could use chemical agents, you could use dispersants and sorbents, so like kind of like a sponge or something like that, or detergent, because polar versus non-polar, all that kind of good stuff. Or you can skim, right? So basically you can like scrape, or you can vacuum off the top. And then for this slide is talking about a very famous oil spill called Exxon Valdez. So Exxon Valdez, this was in the Gulf of Alaska, and it was a very, very large oil spill. And so here to remediate or to kind of fix the problem, they have genetically engineered bacteria to eat oil and break down the oil into smaller hydrocarbons. Other vocab terms to know about oil spills. So the Exxon Valdez in Alaska is very famous. Another very famous one is the Gulf of Mexico, oil spill back in 2010, about 10 years ago. So this is the worst spill in U.S. history. It was caused by the explosion of the Deepwater Horizon oil rig in the Gulf of Mexico. Killed about 11 people, but at least 3.19 million barrels of oil into the ocean. And versus in Alaska, it was 38 million. This is 3.19 million barrels into the ocean. So with that, moving on to plastic. All right, so for plastic, plastic in terms of the degradability takes forever for it to degrade. As you might have heard of like single-use plastics and things like that. There is a section in the Pacific Ocean. Okay, so a section in the Pacific Ocean, it's called the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, or the Pacific Trash Vortex. So in terms of like kind of how it looks, it just depends on the ocean currents. So there's kind of like two sections and things like that. But in terms of what you see, so you're not going to see like a whole bunch of like solid plastic in there. Instead, you're going to see, or there's going to be microplastics, because microplastics, what ends up happening is the way that plastics break down is it needs UV light. And so UV light will break down the bonds within the polymers of the plastic. And then something called photodegrades. So photodegrades is with UV. So with sunlight, plastics can break down into smaller pieces. But within the smaller pieces, like these chemicals such as BPA or BCBs, they end up messing with the aquatic life. Okay? So it ends up excuse me, ends up messing with their like systems and things like that. So here, what else? So it's the physical size of plastic. It kills birds and turtles. I think you probably saw like a picture like this of the albatross. And now it's just like ingesting plastics instead of ingesting food. Maybe you heard about like sea turtles. They're ingesting plastics. So things are trying to get changed. So we are reducing the amount of plastic that just gets released into the ocean. For suspended matter. So suspended matter is something is suspended, kind of just like floating around. And it says here, it eventually will settle out of the water and form silt or mud at the bottom. So if something is like maybe clay, and so clay, when you mix it in water, it looks very murky. That vocab word, the official vocab word for mercury it is turbid. Right, so the cloudiness or the haziness. So all the way on the right, when something is really cloudy, we say that it's murky. And this would be one form of water pollution, because now aquatic life, they can't see through it, right? It's not clear. It's not like clear ocean waters. So this is going to pose a problem for the things that are swimming around in the water. And so examples of things that can cause turbidity, things are like sediment. So sediment is just like rocks, or it's clay, or it's sand, or it could just be chemicals as well, or things like plastics and plastic-like substances. So like fishing nets, fishing lines, and anything that will make the water more murky. And then we got thermal sources. So thermal sources from heat. So usually this is from industry, this is from power plants. So power plants are usually by the coastline. And so they are going to, I guess, dump their hot water into let's go with the ocean. And then they get new water in there. And then what ends up happening is not only are you increasing the temperature of the coast, so you're affecting the aquatic life that lives around there, like cooking the fish, let's say, but also when you have high temperatures, that lowers the solubility of oxygen. And so when you have higher temperatures, not as much oxygen can be held in that water. So if not as much oxygen can be held in that water, then that will also affect the aquatic life and their ability to live in that area. Now we can talk about groundwater pollution. I've been mentioning that a few times with the runoff with the fertilizer. So with groundwater pollution, examples of that, let's say, I think we talked about fracking before. So with fracking, when you see like these little drills, right? So they have to send chemicals through these pipes to loosen up the ground, to get the natural gas, or to get the oil. So with these chemicals end up going into the groundwater for groundwater pollution. And groundwater is very difficult to clean up if it's polluted, unlike oil, right? Oil is floating at the top, but if you have chemicals that are dissolved in water, it's very hard to filter that out, especially if it's in the ground. So for policies and acts, there are two main ones to know. There's the Clean Water Act, that's a big one, and then the Safe Drinking Water Act. I can't remember if we talked about it before, but fracking is exempt from the Safe Drinking Water Act. So there are no like regulations for those kind of companies to limit the chemicals and things like that for the Safe Drinking Water Act. Then there's case studies. Talked about Gulf of Mexico, talked about Minamata disease, and I mentioned something about Exxon Valdez in Alaska, and then the Gulf of Mexico oil spill. And I think that is it. Thank you.